Hello, and welcome to Demystifying the Dark Web. I am Kay Warnock with NCSL. One of our goals today is to have an interactive discussion with you, our audience. Over the next 60 minutes, we will encourage your participation to our chat box. Please feel free to type your questions and answer any questions that you see in the chat box as well. It's in the lower left side of your screen. All discussions in that chat box will be visible to everyone on the webinar. To begin building your comfort with the chat function and to learn who's online today, I invite you to type the state from which you are calling now. At the end of the presentations, we will address the questions that have come through during the hour discussion. To answer one question that you may have, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within about a week. With that, we'll turn to our topic for today. Most people probably think that the dark web is a bad place where only hackers lurk. This session will explain that the parts of the web and how the deep or dark web, while anonymous, is not always used for nefarious purposes. Our presenters today have used the dark web to gather information to help protect their clients. Our first speaker and moderator is Terry Clark, who leads the technical services team of the Kansas legislature, focusing on the IT infrastructure, data centers, and enterprise applications. She is currently serving as Vice Chair of the Kansas Information Technology Security Council and is a member of the NCSL Cybersecurity Task Force. She is active in NAILIT and served as the chair in 2015 and 2016. Terry has a BS in Information Technology from the University of Phoenix and a certificate in Advanced Cybersecurity. Terry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kay. First off, I would like to thank Kay Warnock at NCSL and her team, and also Jeff Ford from the Indiana legislature and a member of NAILIT for organizing this and making this webinar possible today. I know a lot of work went into that. The format for today is I will begin the webinar with an overview of the dark web, and then we'll move into some deeper presentations. Our first presenter, it will be Sean Loveland. He is an applied researcher in the Microsoft Security Response Center. Sean has a long history with dark web intelligence efforts for Microsoft and has been managing dark web research since 2011. He holds 15 patents that he's earned during his time at Microsoft. Our second presenter is Luke McNamara. He's a principal analyst with FireEye Mandiant Intelligence, where he focuses on emerging cyber threats and trends. Luke also has a long history of work with cyber threat intelligence and cyber espionage. So I think we're very fortunate to have two people presenting to us today who have been working in the dark web and cyber intelligence for this period of time. So to begin with, we'll take a look at what the dark web is. There's a lot of mystery around this. And just remember that the dark web was actually designed for anonymity. In the non-private internet, or the public internet that most of us use, we know that most websites have header information that include keywords, so those websites are easily discovered by search engines like Google. Google exists to drive users to these websites. The text on websites is searchable, and the whole website itself is just designed to be discovered on the web. The service providers retain user IP addresses in the non-private web. We also know that our search history is captured. The websites that we have visited is captured in our browsing history, both on our local computer and also by our internet providers. This information is used to pinpoint our geographic locations. Cookies are used to track our browsing habits, and we know that companies like Facebook use this information to present advertising that pertains to our specific interest. We are also aware when we're browsing websites such as Facebook or using Google search that this data is being collected and it's being shared. There's a huge market for this intelligence about users. It drives a lot of purchasing. We know that keywords in our email messages, social media posts are all being captured. In the dark web, that data is not being captured. The websites in the dark web or services are designed to actually block search engines like Google from finding them. So when you go to look at those headers, you're not going to see a list of keywords so Google can find that website and index it. Most of the data in the dark web is unindexed. However, it's not as exciting as you might think. About 90% of that data, by some estimates, is pretty mundane, such as email messages, social media posts, etc. In this picture, I've put up a little very simplified overview of how the dark web works. A user has special software on their client machine, which you'll see off to the left in this diagram, the Tor client. So that's representing your user computer. So with special software to connect to the network and then the Tor browser, a person can connect to the dark web or the Tor network. And once they've entered that network, that traffic is routed through a series of relays. And each of these relays is operated by different people and often volunteers. And each relay adds a layer of encryption. So as that traffic is moving through the Tor network, it is encrypted multiple times. Then, if the destination website is outside of the Tor network, that traffic hits an exit relay or an exit node. The encryption is stripped off, and that is passed on to the destination location. So what's happening here is that as your traffic moves through the Tor network, your IP address is hidden so that it can't be traced back to you, and your IP address will probably appear as the IP address of one of the public exit nodes, an exit relay. Websites within the Tor network do not use a common URL like google.com. They're using what's called an onion address, and that address will be a string of text, just numbers and characters, that ends in .onion. And they're also using public encryption keys to be identified on the web. So it's difficult to identify the location of that website, like what server it actually lives on. All of these pieces combined create a very private environment for web browsing, which has been a little controversial. So it is private, it is anonymous. Many people welcome that, but it's also abused by some people. So moving to the next slide, let's talk about people who are using the dark web. First off, people who are concerned with privacy, and I don't mean just the tinfoil hat people. Many people want to browse privately. They may not want their search history captured. They may not want to use all of the ads, that Facebook is always popping up and other sites. Other groups who can take advantage of the dark web in a positive way are activists and whistleblowers who may actually face repercussions in their work or their private life if they shared information that they become aware of. Citizens in countries that practice censorship can access the dark web and still have access to information from beyond their geographic borders. Facebook, in fact, has a presence on the dark web with an onion address that is often used by people in countries where Facebook and social media sites are censored. Unfortunately, there is still criminal activity because the concepts of privacy and anonymity, of course, kind of create an environment where criminals can flourish. We also have the rise of cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, which makes it possible to transfer funds anonymously. So when you combine all of these factors, then yes, there is definitely a criminal element in the dark web. It is monitored, however, by both law enforcement and cyber professionals. So law enforcement, of course, is looking for criminal activity such as the sale of drugs, child pornography. You hear stories of murder for hire, finding a hitman on the dark web. So even being aware of those events, it's very difficult for them to track down the actual perpetrators of that information and possible criminals. Cyber professionals and law enforcement, but often cyber professionals, are monitoring the dark web for their clients or their employers, looking for stolen user credentials for sale, credit card information, banking information, social security numbers, stolen health data is a pretty big market now, and also stolen proprietary and financial data for corporations. Another area that the dark web should be monitored for organizations are references to your organization or employees. Sometimes these can be just negative references that start rumors, affect public relations and the public image of an organization. It can also highlight problems developing that a company will want to get in front of, an organization will want to get in front and deal with those. And these often can begin on the dark web, where people can report on activities of an organization without repercussions. Activists can also, as we discussed, can use the dark web to organize activities or organize campaigns against or about an issue or an organization. So just being aware that there is activist activity planned that may involve your organization can be helpful. I know several years ago at a NALET seminar, we heard from a sergeant at arms, and they had started monitoring Facebook to identify protests that were being planned at the state capitol, just so they could be prepared with staffing and crowd control measures. So there's a lot of value, practical, actionable intelligence that comes from monitoring the dark web. So overall, for state legislatures, having an understanding of the dark web provides a lot of insight into privacy issues that we're all trying to address now. States are looking at legislation around data privacy, managing data breaches, and cybersecurity in general. So understanding the role the dark web can play in each of those areas is really important to pass effective legislation. But it's also important to understand how important privacy is to individual citizens. Using the dark web is inconvenient. You have to have the special software, you have to use the browser because it's not indexed. A search engine like DuckDuckGo may be helpful, but it's still not going to find everything for you on the web, so on the dark web. So people really go through a lot of manual processes to find information on the dark web. And it's important that we recognize that there are people who are valuing their privacy to such a degree that they will put up with that inconvenience in our current environment. And so that's a basic overview of the dark web and how it operates. At this time, we will move to Sean, and we will learn more about threat intelligence and on the dark web. Sean?
Right, Terry, thank you. And thank you for MCSL to help invite us to come here and talk. So what we're going to do today is talk about dark web intel and how we look at it, or I look at it. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the dark side of the dark web. So companies typically are responsive in nature in defending against attacks. Basically, they're waiting for attackers to attack to figure out, to begin to deploy defenses against the attack. Dark web intel allows companies to be more proactive in their defenses. A lot of cyber defenders talk about a kill chain. And kill chains typically talk about, can they detect the progress of an attack from beginning to end? But normally that involves attacks that they see from within their network. Dark web intel allows you to expand your visibility. You can see attackers preparing for attack, other attackers commissioning an attack against the victim company or individual. You can also see, if the attack was successful, your data for sale or being traded on the dark web. So by doing this and having this extended visibility, companies can prioritize their defenses. They can prepare for attacks prior to the attacks happening, and they can identify attacks from unknown threats. Because, as being in a defensive mode, you're detecting attacks from known threats. By looking at the dark web, you're able to determine what the bad actors are going to do, so you can help detect against unknown threats. So the main thing is to extend your visibility. That's the biggest takeaway from this. The other thing to think about is where the criminals work is not one monolithic area. So in my thinking, we have three different categories. We have what's called open forums, which is basically anybody can get to, Google, Bing, or whatever. It's the indexed web. The next layer up is dark web. And when most companies talk about dark web, they really mean websites in Tor or websites that need a login. And the caliber of criminals and bad actors increase as you go up this. So the criminals that work in the dark web are more sophisticated than the ones that only work in the open forums. So you get to learn a little bit more what's going on. At the top, you have vetted forums. So these are forums that you have to be vetted to get into. It's not just a username and password. You have to know somebody to vouch for you. You have to do an activity to prove you are who you say you are. So think of it as, any physical organized crime, sometimes you have to do stuff to prove who you are. So that's basically the vetted forums. Those forums typically cannot be scraped, so they require humans to go in and view the information. But if you look at all three levels of forums, those make up the dark markets where criminals do their bad behavior. The other thing to think about is years ago, probably about 8-9 years ago, criminals were very generalist. If I wanted to defraud a victim of the money out of their bank account, I had to worry about infecting their computer with malware or phish their credentials, how to get around the bank's anti-fraud detection, and have a money mule that can take that money that I took from the victim or the hardware if I sold stuff from a store and forward it to me. About 8 years ago, the industry started to mature a lot. So just as a normal industry, legitimate real-world industry matures and there becomes specialization, the same thing happened to the criminal world. Criminals specialize in different things. So I don't need to go infect a computer with malware. I can buy a load, which is a load is a victim's computer that has special software that's been installed, either through an exploit kit or whatever, and then the bad actor who created the load then sells those loads off to other people, for example, somebody doing banking malware. And then if I'm doing fraud against the bank, I don't have to write that software. I can either go buy that software to defraud the bank or subscribe to a service that will help me. And if I'm successful getting the money out and I need a money mule to forward the money to me, I can go hire a money mule service in the dark web that will collect the money and then keep a percentage and then forward me on the rest. So we break the ecosystem into 5 regions. One's are attacks against a PC. Another one is attacks against employees and customers, which is another distinct ecosystem. You have attacks against infrastructure. You have cash out services or money muling. And then you have collective knowledge. So criminals trade craft or trading materials on how to do different types of fraud or how to use different types of kits. And the main thing to think about is this is both criminal services and what we call gray market services. Criminal services are black market, they're criminal, they're mostly illegal in nature. Gray market services are kind of on that edge where they offer services to legitimate companies and to criminals. They just don't distinguish between the two. An example of it is spammers. So spammers can go off and be hired by a company to market the latest computer. The same spam service can be hired by a bad actor to send out phishing emails. There are, spammers or mass email marketers, I think is the proper term for them, that filter out the criminals, but a lot of them don't. So this is how we kind of, look at the different parts of the components of a criminal supply chain. The main thing to look at is their services to criminals are quite plentiful and inexpensive. So if I want to go buy an ODay is an unpatched vulnerability in a piece of software that allows malware to be installed on the victim's computer, typically by just visiting a website or opening up a Word document. Depending if it's being sold to criminals or other actors, they can range between $5,000 to $8 million each. I said before, there are loads, and loads are compromised PCs that somebody has compromised, and then they sell the right to push malware to those machines. The average price of that is $530 per 1,000 computers. Just as in the PC, just in the mobile world, you can buy loads on mobile devices to allow me to push my malware to the mobile devices, and it's a little bit higher than PCs, right? $675 per 1,000. However, the price of mobile over time has dropped, so probably in the next 12 months, mobile prices will actually be less than PC prices, mainly this is a result of supply and demand that right now it's dropping because supply is slightly outpacing demand, but demand is increasing, but supply is increasing faster. If I want to do a DDoS service against a company or an individual, there are DDoS services out there. Prices vary, but the average price is $92 to take down a company for a day, up to about $1,000 to take down a company for a month. And it depends on bandwidth, and it depends on the protection the company has. So prices can go higher. If similar to like Tor is being used for privacy, criminals have a service. Well, criminals use Tor, but they also use proxy services to evade geolocation and IP reputation. So if I'm a bad actor doing different things, I may want an IP in a particular zip code, or I may want an IP in a particular state or country or region. And as a criminal, I can go buy access to 100,000 proxies at about $100 a week. And those are typically those are malware-infected computers that have a proxy client installed on them. So it's very inexpensive to get around geosecurity or get around other types of things. If I want to do ransomware, I can buy a ransomware kit for about $66. However, some of the kits have an affiliate model. An affiliate model is pretty cool from a criminal perspective, is that the criminal will, with the ransomware, will charge me 30% of my profit. And for that money, he will handle the ransomware. He will handle the payment. So all I have to do is go off and buy loads, 1,000 computers, 10,000 computers, go to the ransomware, push the ransomware to the loads I just bought, and then sit back and collect my 70% profit. If I want to take over an account, it costs me $100 to $1,000 per successful takeover. So I say, I want, Sean at hotmail.com's password. Services out there that will obtain that for me. If I'm a bad actor, I want to go in the dark web and buy accounts in bulk, and these are username and password pairs, and normally in the clear, so they're not encrypted passwords. You can buy 400 million accounts for as cheap as $150. Average is about 97 cents per thousand. If I want to take over an enterprise account or enterprise network, it costs me about $10,000. And for that, I will get username and passwords and remote access into the corporation. Now, sometimes it's cheaper. I can go buy stuff for, $35 if I needed to. But at high-end companies, high-end government agencies, it averages about $10,000. So we take this intel that we have from the dark web and incorporate it into our features to understand what is happening, understand what will happen in about a 6-month time horizon. So it will happen in about 6 months from now. We look and monitor the kits that criminals are using, the services that they have to better understand the criminal's capabilities and how it evolves over time. We understand the criminal's monetization strategies, because at the end of the day, the tools and techniques the criminals have satisfy a monetization strategy. And if you go after a tool or technique, but you don't go after the underlying motivation of why they're doing an attack, criminals just move to another technique. But if you go after the criminal's monetization strategy, it doesn't matter if there are tools and services that will meet that monetization strategy, because it just doesn't exist anymore. We also collect criminal tradecraft manuals to better understand what they're doing and what they're training themselves to do. And we also monitor vulnerabilities as they come up through the product cycle. So in summary, threat intel, it allows a company to expand the visibility of their kill chain, to understand what's going to happen. Are there bad actors planning an attack? Have criminals or a bad actor gone into a forum and placed a bounty on a company, saying, hey, I will pay anybody $10,000 if they can regain access to this company and exfiltrate this data on my behalf. There are marketplaces for that. It aids companies in prioritizing their defenses. It allows companies to proactively prevent attacks and to identify unknown threats. The other thing to think about is not all threat intel is the same. Of those 3 layers, open source, dark web, embedded, if you want to do this, you're going to want to have a company that can supply you intel across all 3 forums or all 3 levels of forums. The other thing to think about is there's geographic specialization. So if an intelligence vendor has access to Eastern European and Russia, but doesn't have access to, let's say, Latin America, threats that are unique to Latin America are used to attack outside of Latin America or within Latin America, that vendor typically would be blind to those attacks. So it's best that you also need companies that can have geographic coverage. The other thing with dark web is important to do is the context of the attack. Why are criminals trying to gain access to your system? What's the value to a criminal of this data? Because if the value of the data is, let's say, $10 million, criminals are probably willing to spend at least in the tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars of effort to gain access to that data if they know they can sell it for that much money. And then the best case is you can then understand their capabilities, and then you can better predict how they will do what they will do. And on that note, I will pass it on to Luke.
Thanks, Sean. And thanks to NCSL for having us here and hosting this discussion. Happy to talk about how we at Mandiant are thinking about this. And I think it complements a lot of the points Sean was making earlier regarding the dark web and how threat intel vendors like us, how we utilize it. A few things I kind of want to make in terms of kind of general insights and the value that we get as a threat intel provider from monitoring dark web forums. I'll go into a couple case studies that I think highlight what Sean was talking about earlier about expanding your visibility beyond the attack lifecycle and the kill chain of an actual intrusion, and what happens kind of prior to that, how insights into some of these underground forums can give you visibility into the planning stage of that, but also on the back end, potentially when access has been gained and is being sold in the underground, or data sets are being sold in the underground, seeing kind of how threat actors make use of it can be useful, not just from an individual responding to an intrusion or breach of an organization or company, but also understanding kind of how threat actors are monetizing that. And that's always changing. So 3 things in particular I really want to hammer home here. One is that, we think about this in terms of underground forums. And our approach is really kind of looking at not just the dark web, but looking at underground forums and clear web as well. So things that you can access, without utilizing, Tor or accessing the dark web. The reality is that some of the marketplaces and forums where we see adversaries selling data, selling access, include things that you can access without utilizing the dark web. They may be things like a Telegram or a WhatsApp group. We've even seen, some regions where people set up Facebook groups to sell some of this data. So we really think about it holistically in terms of all of those components. And as Sean talked about, even within the dark web, you can think of that as different layers in terms of access, in terms of the amount of vetting that you have to go through, and the amount of engagement you have to maybe take part in via a persona that you set up with specific actors to earn their trust and get further details maybe on a particular tool they're selling or data set they're selling. The other thing I would point out is, as Terry was talking about at the beginning, there's a lot of different, services, illegal services that are offered for sale in the underground. We really are focused on those forums that are specifically related to cyber threat activity. So there's a lot of obviously like illegal, drugs and contraband and other sorts of content that are offered for sale. We're, as a cyber threat intel provider, focused on the ones related to cyber threat activity. And even there, we'll see sort of a variation amongst certain forums that may be focused on carding or selling data sets, maybe some that prohibit the usage of selling DDoS services. So it kind of varies even there amongst the landscape of the utility and value that we get from specific forums. And then maybe the final point I'd make here is that this sort of visibility is useful for answering some types of questions more than others. So one of the areas that we think about threat activity is from the standpoint of adversary motivation. And we kind of break that roughly into three categories. You have your nation state threat actors, groups that are predominantly engaged, from what we see for the most part in activity like cyber espionage, some destructive and disruptive attacks as well. You have your hacktivist activity. So these are individuals that are motivated typically by ideology. Don't see as much there as we used to in kind of like the heyday of Anonymous and LulzSec. But that's certainly still something that we see kind of around the globe, different people involved in that. And then lastly, and I think this is really the area where insights into the dark web provide a lot of value, is the cybercrime area, financially motivated threat actors. So this sort of like insights we gain here, less useful for understanding, for example, what an advanced persistent threat or APT group, a nation state, typically espionage group is doing. You don't see them typically planning, sort of campaigns and intrusions in these forums. However, the sorts of accesses that can be offered for sale, that could give us understanding of the tools, the accesses that are available to some of these groups that they could certainly leverage. But typically we don't see, an APT group offering access to an organization they've compromised or soliciting access, directly in the same way. So very, very useful, I would say, more so for the cybercrime type activity. As I mentioned, variation across the different forums in terms of what they're selling, and some of them being kind of more explicit about certain things that they won't sell. For example, DDoS, as I mentioned, kind of, in some forums where that is banned as a service. As Sean mentioned, one of the things over the years that we've seen is a sort of increasing professionalization, right? So this is an industry like any other, and in any industry, actors and organizations and groups will focus on specializing in certain things. So you've seen sort of the rise of ransomware as a service, or DDoS as a service, or threat actors that just focus and specialize in carding. So that, I think, is something that's kind of indicative over the entire ecosystem, is that specialization that we see, in particular areas of this. Language is also a very important thing, as Sean mentioned. We have groups of researchers around the globe that we hire with native local language capability to access certain forums. In certain forums, for example, English speakers are going to be viewed as more suspicious, where you're entering kind of a Russian language forum. So that's certainly an important thing for us to keep in mind, not just in terms of being able to access and understand what's being discussed, but in terms of having the authenticity to really engage credibly with the threat actors. Some of the other things here, as I mentioned, there's different areas where we see these markets taking place, including ClearWeb and others. I showed here on this side here some of the data that we had from a report we did looking at healthcare data that was being offered for sale in the underground. And it's interesting, you see the sort of variation in these data sets that are coming from healthcare insurers or other institutions Often, these are being sold to kind of further other sorts of fraudulent activity. And the amount of data that's there, the quality of data, if it includes things like social security numbers, the location of the data, are these individuals in a particular country? All of that can have variation on the price, and that's why you will see, even in the small sample size, kind of a fluctuation variation across the different data sets that are offered for sale in the underground. One thing I also want to bring up, Terry mentioned earlier the usage of cryptocurrency in some of these underground forums. One of the interesting things I think we've seen is how Bitcoin has still been the predominant and favored cryptocurrency of usage in the underground, even with other more anonymous cryptocurrencies like Zcash or Monero. Bitcoin, for probably a variety of different reasons, maybe stability, maybe the fact that it's often the cryptocurrency requested in a lot of ransomware payments. That's still being by far the most utilized cryptocurrency we're seeing, where adversaries or threat actors are trading different tools and services in the underground. And then, of course, if we're looking at all this data, one of the things that we have to keep in mind for these different postings is how do we evaluate the veracity of a particular post? So the process of creating threat intelligence is not just taking the raw data that we gather from a place like the underground forums that we're monitoring and looking at, but we have to vet and contextualize that data. Does this fit with what we know about the threat landscape? Does it fit with what we know this particular threat actor has commented on in the past? Have they been known to be a reliable source? If they claim that they've been able to compromise an entity, an organization, have we seen evidence of that in the past? Or maybe this is a posting that is new by someone who just registered an account a couple days earlier, right? So all those different things kind of play into how we take into account that sort of data and how we vet it and produce intelligence off of it. So a couple case studies to highlight, I think, how this visibility can be useful when we're dealing with maybe traditional intrusion sets and activity where a threat actor is attempting to or has gained access to a victim environment. So this first one is kind of focused on the back end of that sort of operation. There is a threat actor we were monitoring going back to at least 2011. This particular threat actor, we'll call it G, specialized in website compromises, and they've been observed selling various accesses to organizations, selling some databases as well. So they were selling not just the access, but in some cases, data they had stolen from victim entities. From their postings over the years, we noticed, they seem to have impacted a very wide set of organizations. Typically, though, with a very shallow level of compromise. They weren't making sort of deep intrusions into victim networks, and in some cases had run into issues where they weren't able to kind of properly maintain access or fully exploit the victim organization once they gained access. What was interesting is in at least starting in July 2018, we identified a set of intrusion operations. We'll call this cluster D, right? So these are intrusion operations where the technical components, the sort of digital fingerprints, the tools that were used, we were kind of able to connect these all together across multiple different breaches at various victim organizations. And one of the things that we pieced together and connected back to Actor G was that some of this activity that Actor G was discussing related to ongoing intrusions was actually, and lined it up with the tool sets, the characteristics, and the victim entities that we saw being compromised at these organizations we were responding to. So basically in this sort of situation, we were able to see to a moderate degree of confidence, link a set of intrusions to how a threat actor was, selling those accesses in the underground, what they were trying to do with that, and gave us kind of greater understanding of what the motivations of the adversary was in the situation. Another example and case study I think that highlights how this sort of visibility can work prior to an intrusion goes to the issue of ransomware. So ransomware continues to be a growing challenge for a lot of organizations in a wide array of different sectors. You see here in this chart organizations that we've responded to over the last couple of years, the jump that we saw in 2019, and I can assure you this has continued into this year, 2020, in terms of just a significant uptick in ransomware breaches that we're responding to. In this particular case, and this is actually from earlier this year, a threat actor that we'll call B advertised a ransomware affiliate program. So Sean mentioned this earlier, where you may have someone that develops a particular ransomware family, a new family or a new piece of malware of ransomware, and then they will work with affiliates in a profit-sharing scheme to basically assist in the deployment of that ransomware into victim entities. And so you will often, and this is one of the reasons why you see such a sort of wide variation of targets, is because they may be working with a group of different threat actors that are going after, particularly entities that are in industries or spaces where they require a high uptime. Think things like manufacturing or other different professions where they need to maintain access to those systems. They may also go for ones that they see as relatively insecure, where they're able to kind of gain easy access. They may scan for vulnerable, infrastructure that they can penetrate and then deploy this. And a lot of what we're seeing now today, too, is threat actors that once they gain access, they're trying to move around laterally and identify the crown jewels of the organization, and sometimes even stealing that and posting those or threatening to post that data in the open in an effort to kind of ramp up the pressure. But what's interesting is that this was a situation where we're able to get some insight into how the threat actor was planning on going about, developing this affiliate model, kind of breaking down a structure where, depending on how much they were able to get in terms of ransoms from victims, that would kind of dictate what the profit share split would be with the entities. One other interesting thing I would note here is the fact that, and this has been the case with a couple different groups of, at least a few different groups that we see operating in some of these forums, where they specifically note that they will not participate in the targeting of organizations or assets in countries in the former, what's called the Commonwealth of Independent States, or former Soviet bloc countries. That's something we see from a lot of Eastern European threat actors that, realize if they conduct targeting in those regions, they will, bring a lot more of the local law enforcement attention to them. Whereas if they operate targeting entities in Western Europe, United States, and elsewhere, a lot of times that they will, maybe there's some tacit degree of allowance for that sort of activity. But we see that a lot with different threat actors operating from those regions where they specifically do not want to target entities in the same region that they are operating in. And since May, we've seen the cluster of this sort of group carrying out ransomware operations that have impacted entities in education, manufacturing, local government, really across the gamut of operations. So a couple closing bits of food for thought that I think, as we go into the discussion session here and even afterwards, some things I think that are worth considering when we're thinking about how this space may evolve and change. I mentioned that, some of the groups, a lot of the groups that we're monitoring, looking at, they sort of have this delineation from other groups that may be selling drugs or other illicit activity and contraband. And, if there is an increased prioritization in the past by international law enforcement to go after those other sorts of forums and marketplaces, with the expansion and impact of ransomware, I think it'll be interesting to see if these specific forums and marketplaces that are selling tools like ransomware see increased law enforcement targeting and operations focused on them. Because it continues to be, I think, a significant problem, and one that a wide range of entities here in the United States are being impacted with, weekly. The other thing is I think will be interesting is one of the challenges for us as a threat intel company is we're always trying to ascertain the attribution aspect of the threat activity that we are monitoring and tracking. And what I mean by that is trying to ascertain who is behind that. So when we think about those different adversary motivations that are carrying out intrusions, that are carrying out campaigns for a variety of different reasons, not just understanding the motivation, but understanding who is behind that, whether it's a specific criminal, whether it's a military intelligence entity in a particular country, or something that is sponsored by a particular country. That's always something that we are trying to ascertain in order to better understand the context of why a particular organization or individual is being targeted. And one of the difficult things is, as we've seen more and more threat actors that are selling access in the underground, that makes it more difficult to ascertain who is the end user of that access. Who is benefiting off of that? If technically we can see the tools that are used and maybe we know a particular threat actor is the one that gained access, but the data that they're selling, the access they're selling, we don't necessarily know who is leveraging that. And so that's something that will, I think, continue to be a challenge, but one that is important for us to focus on, again, to really understand the impact from some of these breaches. And then lastly, an area that I think it kind of merits further investigation and analysis, and some folks at our organization here at Mandiant who work on threats to cyber physical and operational technology, or OT systems, have done some good research on this, and I would recommend, if anyone's interested, you can check out some of our blogs related to this topic. But we're seeing an increased interest in the underground forums by what we believe for the most part are financially motivated threat actors in targeting OT systems and assets. Why this is so important is because the targeting of those systems by things like ransomware or even destructive tools could have impacts in the kinetic space. So you think about the deployment of something destructive in, let's say, a manufacturing, factory setting, the impact of that on safety controls, something in a plant, something in a refinery, all of those could have cascading real-world impacts. Historically, we've not seen a lot of that activity, fortunately, and a lot of where we have seen that has been nation-state actors, but we increasingly see examples where threat actors are discussing potentially targeting these systems, maybe not necessarily directly right now, and maybe the intent is, again, something like ransomware. They're trying to increase the pain on the victim entity, but the concern around the cascading impacts should something go awry, or threat actors that once they've penetrated those systems are selling that access to someone else, I think is concerning. So definitely something that I think is an area for further consideration, and we'll have to kind of keep an eye on as the space develops. With that, I will turn it back over.
Okay, thank you, Sean and Luke, both of you, for these presentations. And we do have a couple of questions. We have two questions that are just asking for definitions, and I have another question for you. So let's knock out the definitions first. For Sean, what does TTPM mean? You referenced that in your presentation. And can you also tell us what Tor means?
So let me start off with TTPM. So you always have to have one or several acronyms in any presentation. So TTPs, let's start with those. That's tools, techniques, and procedures. That's the how criminals do what they do. The M can either mean motivation or monetization strategy, and that is the why they're doing what they're doing. And it's important to always look at the why, because, for example, there's one bad actor selling compromised credentials through a store. He makes approximately $250,000 a month. A bad actor selling access to companies, he's making, or his team is making approximately $250,000 per week. So it's always looking at the motivations because you understand what is their tenacity and what will be their capabilities that they can bring to bear on a victim. Do you want me to answer Tor, or does somebody else want to answer Tor?
Oh, you're on a roll. Keep going.
So Tor is, what is it? I forgot what it is. Actually, I'll let somebody do it because the acronym just slipped my mind. I know what it is, but I forgot what the Tor stands for.
It's the onion router.
That's right.
Yeah, and it's not an acronym. It is a name, so
yeah.
a little different.
It was it DARPA or Department of Navy, U.S. Department of Navy is the one who originated it to help people in repressed areas of the world communicate on the internet.
Thank you. And then, Luke, I had a thought as you were wrapping up on your final slide, food for thought. As legislatures are looking into privacy issues, the bills that are being crafted are primarily putting the responsibility for data protections on the organizations holding that data. And it just really feels, I don't know how, I'm not going to suggest a better way to do that today, but that these organizations are just being hammered from all sides. So they're now facing legal liability for data breaches. They're being hammered by the criminal element that data is dropping off into underground forums, so very difficult for law enforcement to take action. Just where do you see all of this going in the next 3 to 5 years? And Sean, you can chime in on this as well, as far as how organizations are going to be able to manage this.
Sure. Yeah. So I will start by saying that I am not a lawyer, so I will refrain from wading into the liability aspects of this. But I think that from the standpoint of securing the data, over the years you've seen a lot of the mindset evolve with protecting organizations go from just having strong perimeter defenses, but realizing that that's often not enough. That you need sort of a robust and resilient system in place to catch adversaries at kind of every step of the kill chain. So when they're able to kind of make gain a foothold in your organization, when they're pivoting around, when they're moving laterally, when they're escalating privileges, so being able to kind of interdict and respond to adversary activity once they gain in can often being able to do that quickly and being able to do that before they've been able to impact critical systems or abscond with key data, I think is a big piece of that, rather than just, building high walls essentially around the perimeter. But I think threat intelligence can also help with not just the response to a breach, response to an event, but again, get to this sort of impact. Who is behind this? What is their intent? What are they trying to do with this data? And I think that might be something that we see taken into consideration more in the future when it comes to, who is behind this? To what extent does the liability, should an organization face liability, for example, if they're up against a Russian state agency, and they've been targeted with the resources, behind the Russian state government, right? So maybe there's specific things steps that they should be expected to take into consideration and proper due diligence when it comes to securing their organization. But who targets you, who successfully targets you and compromises you, that may have a piece that we see play into some of the decisions around liability in the future.
Mm-hmm. Sean, do you have thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I think generically intel from the dark web helps talk about what are the capabilities of a bad actor that they could come to bear on a victim if the criminals elected to target that victim. The other thing to think about is looking at your data from a criminal's perspective and how much value it is for them to get access to it. Would be a good predictor of if criminals were to attack you, what their goal is. So you could harden those assets a little bit more to help compensate for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So I don't see any more questions, and we are just a couple minutes past 1 o'clock. So Kay, I'll turn it over to you unless some other questions have come in.
Thank you, Terry. Yeah, there are no other questions, but if you have other questions along the way, you can certainly email me at any time, and I will get back to you with answers. I really appreciate everyone participating today, and thank you so much to Terry and Sean and Luke for sharing their time with us and their valuable information. Thank you so much, and have a great day.